Hello, Daisy Cakes! I want to talk about not one, but three books today, collectively called the Greenwich Village Trilogy. Why? Because I am Daisy X Nakana, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. This is my series where I read nominees from the early Hugo Awards to find authors or books I haven't read before. Now, for the 1968 Hugos, I picked The Butterfly Kid by Chester Anderson because I had never heard of the book or the author, but I did find out this was a psychedelic science fiction comedy trilogy with each book written by a different author. So I thought, let's read all three. They're short, and I've always been fascinated by the 1960s counterculture movement. But first, let's talk about the authors. The first book of the Greenwich Village trilogy, The Butterfly Kid, the 1968 Hugo nominee, was written by Chester Anderson. Chester Anderson was born in 1932 and died in 1991 at the age of 58. He did not publish much, some poetry when he was younger. His first book was a super short comedy about a cat house called The Pink Palace, and good luck finding a copy of that one. His second novel was a science fiction novel called 10 Years to Doomsday, co-authored by Michael Kurland, who wrote the second book in the Greenwich Village trilogy. So The Butterfly Kid would be Anderson's third novel. After that, there wasn't much else, but with his earnings from The Butterfly Kid, he moved to San Francisco during the Summer of Love and became an underground publisher who was immortalized by Joan Didion in Slouching Towards Bethlehem. The second book of the Greenwich Village trilogy was written by Michael Kurland, called The Unicorn Girl. Michael Kurland was born in 1938 and is still alive and active today at the age of 88. Like I said before, he was the co-author with Chester Anderson in a prior science fiction book, 10 Years to Doomsday, but you may also have heard me mention him before in another video, namely Too Many Magicians, because he was the author who continued the Lord Darcy fantasy adventures. Spoiler, I'll be mentioning that again when I talk about his book. Kurland was the most successful author of the three Greenwich Village writers, having written over 30 fiction and nonfiction books, his most successful probably the Professor Moriarty series. The third book of the Greenwich Village trilogy, The Probability Pad, was written by the most cryptic of the three authors, T.A. Waters. T.A. Waters, or Thomas Allen Waters, was born in 1938 and died in 1998, presumably at the age of 60. Although he published a couple of novels before The Probability Pad, afterwards he only wrote nonfiction, his most famous book of which is Mind, Myth, and Magic, published in 1993, the definitive work on mentalism tricks of stage magicians. Yes, T.A. Waters was a professional stage magician. In fact, at one point, he was the librarian at the Magic Castle, the infamous headquarters of the Academy of Magical Arts, located in Hollywood. Since the trilogy was named after Greenwich Village, we have to talk about Greenwich Village. If you don't know, Greenwich Village is a neighborhood in New York that's known as the epicenter for artists and writers and musicians going way back to the 1850s, when they called themselves Bohemians and tried to recreate the Café Society in Paris, where writers and artists met. During that time, the most famous writer who held court was none other than Walt Whitman. Over the decades, Greenwich Village would evolve and transform, but always being a magnet for art and literature and music. Notably, it was the home of the beat writers in the 50s like Burroughs and Ginsberg and Kerouac. In the 60s, it was Norman Mailer, Maya Angelou, Bob Dylan, and a host of others. If you want to know more, check out the documentary, The Ballad of Greenwich Village. So this brings us to the three authors of the Greenwich Village trilogy. I can only imagine Chester Anderson, Michael Kurland, and T.A. Waters sitting in a coffee house and coming up with these novels. In fact, in the preface to The Unicorn Girl, Michael Kurland describes the Greenwich Village science fiction crowd. There, in and around Greenwich Village, lived the gang: Randall the Cardinal Garrett, Larry the Whip Janifer. Now, Garrett wrote the Lord Darcy novels and co-authored with Larry Janifer for That Sweet Little Old Lady, which I covered before. Phil, Big Bill 10 Class, Avram the Rabbi Davidson, Catherine Beautiful Kate McLean, Bob the Pope Silverberg, Harlan the Kid Ellison, kind of hilarious, Ellison was called the Kid, Logical Howard Schoenfeld, Magic Tom Waters, that of course is T.A. Waters, author of the third Greenwich Village book, Willie the Professor Lay, and that has to be Lester Del Rey, right? What I love about these books is how it captures this very specific moment in time and space, the counterculture hippie drug movement of the 1960s, and yes, the stories are trippy and psychedelic and funny. So let's start with the first book. The Butterfly Kid by Chester Anderson was published in 1967 and was nominated for the Hugo in 1968. Each of the books in this trilogy has forewords by well-known authors, and The Butterfly Kid has an introduction from none other than Peter S. Beagle, who starts off with, "If you remember the 60s, you weren't there," and ends with noting that the story is dated by today's standards, especially with the lack of Black people, who are certainly very much a part of the Greenwich Village scene at the time. The story itself is about the main characters, Chester Anderson and his best friend Michael Kurland. Yes, the main characters are based on the author and his roommate, the roommate being Michael Kurland, who would go on to write the second book in the trilogy. It's told in first person from Chester or Chet's point of view. Anyway, they run across a teeny bopper boy who can't stop creating butterflies. By the way, the term teeny bopper is used extensively in this story, and it's basically any teenager. The teeny bopper here that's creating butterflies is an 18-year-old boy named Sean from Texas, and they find out he can't stop creating these butterflies. And they trace that to Sean having popped a mysterious blue pill the night before. Come to find out, these pills are called reality pills and are being handed out by this very unsavory acquaintance of theirs named Laszlo Scott. Anyone who takes these pills trips and then manifests some sort of hallucination in reality. And this is all part of a nefarious plot involving giant blue lobsters who are using Laszlo to distribute the pills for a mysterious purpose. The story takes place sometime in the near future. We know that it's not the present for the 1960s because there are vidiphones, phones with a video, if you can imagine, and they use these hovercraft buses. But the culture is basically 1960s New York City. I thought this story was a lot of fun, but what I liked most was how it painted a picture of how Greenwich Village must have been during this time period. The attitude towards drugs and sex, the extensive use of slang. It all felt like we're taking a dive into the counterculture of Greenwich Village in 1968. Now, like Peter Beagle said, it is dated. And the objectification of women was a little bit yucky. There was a derogatory term for gays that was thrown out. It's a word that rhymes with maggot. And also the term for a person of color was thrown out, that term being the suit of a playing card. But it wasn't done maliciously, I would say. It was done, I wouldn't say affectionately, but it was done sort of casually. It didn't really bother me, but it did make me stop and go, oh yeah, this is dated. And going to the gays, the god of teeny boppers, don't ask, attracted girls as well as a few boys, which Anderson remarked, oh, I didn't expect that of them. Again, it felt a little bit dated, and nothing was derogative about it. And remember, this was written before Stonewall. Moving on to the second book of the Greenwich Village trilogy, The Unicorn Girl by Michael Kurland, published in 1969, has an introduction by Richard Lupoff, who I've never read before, but he was a writer of science fiction, but also an expert on science fiction, writing nonfiction books and interviewing well-known sci-fi writers in a radio program called Probabilities. Frankly, these books are worth it just for the introduction. Lupoff discusses the 60s as a crucible that either shaped or destroyed people. Michael Kurland's Unicorn Girl stars Michael Kurland, of course, and his best friend Chester Anderson. And guess what? There's a third character that becomes prominent more in the second half of the book, named Tom Waters. And yes, Tom Waters is T.A. Waters, the author of the third book in the Greenwich Village trilogy. So now you see how this trilogy works. Chapter 1 begins, it was a year after the butterfly. So it's the same world that Anderson created in The Butterfly Kid and picks up a year later. This is told from Michael's point of view, and the story opens in a club where Chester's band is playing, and Michael sees the girl of his dreams, literally of his dreams, the girl he created in his fantasy when he was 12 years old. Of course, he goes over and meets her. She tells him her name is Sylvia, and she is looking for her unicorn. Cutting to the chase, the girl is from a different dimension. Mike and Chet try to help her. They run into yet another nefarious plot by aliens. They blip through dimensions, and in one of the dimensions, guess what? It is a world created by Randall Garrett for his Lord Darcy mysteries. Remember, Michael Kurland goes on to officially write more Lord Darcy novels, and Randall Garrett is the first person mentioned in his list of Greenwich Village science fiction writers, so there must have been a close connection between those two. And yes, Tom Waters comes in and takes on a big role in the second half of the story. I thought this book was also fun. I personally did not enjoy it as much as A Butterfly Kid because it spends most of its time in other dimensions rather than in the 60s counterculture, but it's a short read and I'm glad I read it. This brings us to the third and final novel in the Greenwich Village trilogy, The Probability Pad by T.A. Waters, published in 1970. This one has a foreword by Barbara Hambly, a very prolific author of science fiction and fantasy. In fact, she was the president of Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America for several years. Hambly talks about how entertained she was of how the main characters, who were the authors, described each other and how those perceptions differed from one another. The story takes place the spring after the time bubble, which is what he calls the events of the Unicorn Girl. It is, of course, told from Tom Waters' point of view, and of course also stars Chester Anderson and Michael Kurland. The other two books, you barely notice that it takes place in the near future, or near future from the 1960s. This book actually relies on future technology. I'll point to again the vidiphones of the first book, which come to play an important role. So maybe this is the most science fiction-y of the trilogy. The trio of heroes, Mike, Chet, and Tom, begin to notice something weird is going on. They're seeing duplicates of people and come to find out there may be duplicates of themselves. For instance, Tom obviously didn't have sex with a woman the night before because he was with someone else, but this woman is convinced he did. So who did she have sex with? You get what's happening. There is also a pretty great villain in this story, a slimy agent for musicians called Mystic Jake. There's also another alien threat that they must save the world from. Overall, I liked the Greenwich Village trilogy, all three books. I'm glad I read it. My favorite was Chester Anderson's The Butterfly Kid, simply because that one was the most obvious window into that very specific time and place. 1960s Greenwich Village. All three books had a cleverness in the writing, in the prose, which makes me wonder what sort of collaboration went on behind the scenes when these were written, because to me, anyway, there is a little bit of similarity in the humor and wit and style of the writing. What about you? Have you read or do you want to read any of the books in the Greenwich Village trilogy? Let me know down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. And keep an eye out when I choose a book from the 1969 Hugo Awards. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.